The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rolling hills of Montana Territory as Jonathan Whitmore guided his prize stallion along Dusty Creek Road, returning from another successful cattle sale that had added several $1,000s to his already considerable fortune. At 42 years old, Jonathan was one of the wealthiest ranchers in 3 counties, owner of the sprawling Circle W Ranch that stretched across 15,000 acres of prime grazing land. His success had come through a combination of shrewd business sense, relentless determination, and the kind of single-minded focus on profit that had earned him respect from his peers and fear from his competitors. Jonathan's expensive suit, tailored in San Francisco and shipped by rail to the frontier, marked him as a man of substance and sophistication, even in this rough country. His gold pocket watch, inherited from his father, caught the sunlight as he checked the time with the habitual precision of someone who measured success in dollars and efficiency. Everything about his appearance, from his polished leather boots to his perfectly groomed mustache, spoke of wealth and status carefully cultivated over decades of building his empire. The road stretched ahead of him like a ribbon of dust and possibility, winding through the kind of landscape that had made men rich and broken others completely. Jonathan had traveled this route hundreds of times over the years, conducting business deals that had steadily expanded his holdings and increased his influence throughout the territory. He knew every landmark, every ranch house, every water source along the way, and he took pride in the fact that much of the land he could see belonged to him. But as his horse crested a small hill, Jonathan saw something that made him pull back on the reins and study the scene ahead with growing concern. A covered wagon sat motionless beside the road, its canvas top torn and flapping in the prairie wind like a wounded bird trying to fly. One wheel was clearly broken, causing the entire vehicle to list dangerously to one side, and there was no sign of the horses that should have been hitched to the front. As Jonathan approached cautiously, he could see a woman sitting in the meager shade cast by the disabled wagon, her thin frame hunched with exhaustion and despair. She appeared to be in her 30s, though hardship had carved lines in her face that made her look older, and her clothes, while clean and carefully mended, showed the unmistakable signs of genteel poverty. Beside her sat 2 children, a boy of perhaps 10 and a girl who couldn't have been more than 6, their faces gaunt with hunger and their eyes holding the hollow look of those who had known too much suffering for their tender years. Jonathan's first instinct was to ride past without stopping, as he had done countless times when encountering other travelers in distress. His wealth had been built partly on his ability to avoid emotional entanglements that might interfere with business decisions, and he had learned long ago that stopping to help every unfortunate soul he encountered was a luxury he couldn't afford. If he wanted to maintain his position in the territorial hierarchy, but something about the dignity with which the woman held herself, even in her obvious desperation, made him hesitate. She wasn't begging or making a spectacle of her misfortune, but simply enduring whatever fate had brought her to this lonely stretch of road, with the kind of quiet courage that spoke of inner strength forged by adversity. "Ma'am," Jonathan said, tipping his hat with the courtesy that had been bred into him from childhood, despite his reputation for ruthless business practices. "Appears you're having some difficulty with your wagon. Might I ask what happened?" The woman looked up at him, with eyes the color of storm clouds, and Jonathan felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. She was beautiful, he realized, though her beauty was the kind that came from character rather than mere physical features. There was intelligence in her gaze, and strength, and a weariness that spoke of battles fought with dignity, even in defeat. "The wheel broke this morning," she said simply, her voice carrying the cultured accents of someone who had received a proper education despite her current circumstances. "Our horses bolted when it happened. probably spooked by the noise. We've been walking since dawn, trying to find help, but there hasn't been another soul on this road until now." Jonathan dismounted and walked around the disabled wagon, his practiced eye taking in the extent of the damage. The wheel was beyond repair, the axle was cracked, and several of the wooden supports showed signs of wear that suggested the vehicle had been held together by determination and prayer for far longer than was safe for travel. "This wagon's not going anywhere without major repairs," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to solving problems through decisive action. "Where were you headed?" "California," the woman replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "My husband died of consumption 6 months ago, and we lost our farm to creditors. I heard there might be work in the mining camps, teaching children or keeping books for store owners. We've been traveling for 3 weeks trying to reach the railroad in Denver." The story was depressingly familiar to Jonathan, who had seen dozens of families broken by illness, debt, and the harsh realities of frontier life. The difference was that this woman had maintained her dignity in the face of catastrophe, had held her small family together despite impossible odds, and was still fighting to build a future from the ashes of her past. "What's your name, ma'am?" Jonathan asked, his businesslike tone softening slightly as he looked at the 2 children who were watching him with the cautious hope of those who had learned not to expect too much from strangers. "Elizabeth Morrison," she replied, straightening her shoulders with unconscious pride. "These are my children, David and Sarah. We don't have much to offer in return for help, but I can cook and clean, and I'm educated enough to keep books or teach school if someone would give me the chance." Jonathan found himself studying Elizabeth Morrison with the same analytical attention he usually reserved for potential business investments. She was clearly intelligent, obviously hard-working despite her current circumstances, and possessed of the kind of moral strength that couldn't be bought or taught. Her children were well-behaved and clean, despite their obvious hunger, suggesting that she had maintained standards of conduct, even in the most trying circumstances. "Mrs. Morrison," Jonathan said slowly, his mind already working through the implications of what he was about to propose. "I own a large ranch about 10 miles from here. I'm in need of someone to manage my household, someone who can handle the domestic arrangements for a busy operation. The position would include room and board for you and your children, plus wages that would allow you to save money for whatever future you choose to build." Elizabeth's eyes widened with surprise and something that might have been hope, though her expression remained cautious. She had learned to be wary of offers that seemed too good to be true, especially from wealthy men who encountered lone women in vulnerable circumstances. "That's very generous, mister," she said, leaving the question hanging in the air between them. "Whitmore. Jonathan Whitmore of the Circle W Ranch." He paused, studying her reaction to his name, which was well known throughout the territory for both his wealth and his reputation for hard-dealing business practices. "I should be clear about the terms, Mrs. Morrison. This would be a business arrangement, nothing more. You would be an employee with clearly defined duties and fair compensation. Your children would be welcome, and there's a schoolhouse in town where they could receive proper education." The offer was more than Elizabeth had dared to hope for when she woke up that morning beside her broken wagon, wondering how she would feed her children or find shelter for the night. But she was an intelligent woman who understood that accepting help from a powerful stranger might come with complications she couldn't anticipate. "Mr. Whitmore," she said carefully, "I appreciate your offer more than you know, but I need to understand exactly what would be expected of me, and what assurances I would have that my children and I would be safe in your employment." Jonathan nodded approvingly, recognizing the intelligence behind her caution. "You would manage the household staff, oversee meal preparation for the ranch hands, handle correspondence and bookkeeping for the domestic side of the operation, and ensure that my home reflects the standards appropriate to my position in the community. In return, you and your children would have comfortable quarters, 3 meals a day, medical care when needed, and wages of $50 a month plus annual bonuses based on the ranch's performance. The salary he named was more than Elizabeth had ever dreamed of earning, enough to allow her to save money while providing security for her children. But more importantly, his business-like manner and specific terms suggested that he was treating her as a professional rather than a charity case. "And if I chose to leave your employment," she asked, "you would be free to go at any time with 2 weeks' notice," Jonathan replied. "I would provide transportation to wherever you wish to go, plus a letter of recommendation that would help you find other employment." Elizabeth looked at her children, seeing in their faces the hope that had been missing for too many months. David, at 10, was old enough to understand that their situation had been desperate before this unexpected encounter. Sarah, barely 6, simply trusted that her mother would make the right decision for their family. "I accept your offer, Mr. Whitmore," Elizabeth said quietly. "When would you like us to start?" "Immediately," Jonathan replied, already planning how to get the broken wagon and its occupants back to his ranch. "I'll send some of my men back for your belongings tomorrow. For now, let's get you and the children fed and settled." As Jonathan helped Elizabeth and her children onto his horse for the ride to the Circle W ranch, he told himself that he was simply making a practical business decision. His household had been managed by a series of unsatisfactory housekeepers, and Mrs. Morrison's obvious intelligence and education made her a valuable addition to his staff. But as they rode toward his ranch house in the gathering dusk, with Elizabeth's warm presence behind him on the saddle and her children's laughter echoing across the prairie, Jonathan Whitmore began to suspect that this encounter on Dusty Creek Road might change more than just his domestic arrangements. The Circle W ranch house rose from the Montana prairie like a monument to success and ambition, its 2-story frame construction and wraparound porch marking it as the home of a man who had achieved everything the frontier could offer. Jonathan had built the house 5 years earlier, modeling it after the grand homes he had seen during business trips to Denver and San Francisco, complete with modern conveniences like indoor plumbing and gas lighting that were still rare luxuries. In ranch country, as they approached the imposing structure in the fading light of evening, Elizabeth felt a mixture of awe and apprehension at the thought of managing such an elaborate household. The house was larger than any building she had ever lived in, with multiple chimneys, decorative trim, and windows that glowed warmly with the promise of comfort and security her children hadn't known for months. "Impressive, isn't it?" Jonathan said, noting her expression as they rode up the circular drive that led to the front entrance. "I spared no expense when I built it. Figured a man's home should reflect his position in the community, show visitors that the Circle W Ranch is a serious operation run by serious people." The pride in his voice was unmistakable, and Elizabeth could understand why. The ranch house represented years of hard work and careful planning, a tangible symbol of success in a land where failure was always one drought or harsh winter away. But she also sensed something else in his tone, a loneliness that suggested all this grandeur might feel empty when experienced alone. "It's beautiful," Elizabeth said sincerely. "You must be very proud of what you've accomplished here." Jonathan helped Elizabeth and her children down from his horse, his movements showing an unexpected gentleness when dealing with Sarah, who was clearly intimidated by the size and grandeur of her new surroundings. The little girl stayed close to her mother's side, her eyes wide with wonder at the polished floors and elegant furnishings visible through the tall windows. "Mrs. Patterson," Jonathan called out as they entered the front hall, his voice echoing off the high ceilings and hardwood floors. "Come meet our new housekeeper." An elderly woman emerged from what Elizabeth assumed was the kitchen, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron and studying the newcomers with the kind of direct assessment that spoke of decades spent evaluating people and situations. Mrs. Patterson was clearly the current domestic authority in the house, and Elizabeth realized that her success in this position would depend partly on winning the older woman's approval and cooperation. "This is Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison and her children, David and Sarah," Jonathan said by way of introduction. "Mrs. Morrison will be taking over management of the household, effective immediately. Mrs. Patterson, I'd like you to show them to the family quarters and help them get settled." Elizabeth caught the subtle shift in Mrs. Patterson's expression at the mention of family quarters rather than servants' quarters, a distinction that suggested Jonathan was treating his new employee with unusual consideration. The older woman's sharp eyes moved from Elizabeth to the children, taking in their obvious exhaustion and hunger with the kind of maternal instinct that transcended social boundaries. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had been running the domestic side of the ranch long before Elizabeth's arrival. "I'll get them fed and settled. The children look like they could use a good meal and a proper night's sleep." "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson," Elizabeth said gratefully. "I know this arrangement is probably unexpected for you, and I hope we can work together to keep Mr. Whitmore's household running smoothly." The diplomatic tone of Elizabeth's response seemed to favorably impress the older woman, who nodded approvingly, before leading the small family toward the rear of the house. The quarters Jonathan had designated for them turned out to be a comfortable suite of rooms on the first floor, with a sitting area, 2 bedrooms, and private access to a bathroom that represented luxury beyond anything Elizabeth had imagined. "Mr. Whitmore doesn't usually take in families," Mrs. Patterson said as she helped Elizabeth settle the children in their new bedroom. "Been through a half-dozen housekeepers in the past 2 years. None of them lasting more than a few months. He's particular about how things are done, and he doesn't suffer fools or lazy workers." "What happened to the previous housekeepers?" Elizabeth asked, sensing that understanding Jonathan's expectations would be crucial to her success in this position. "Different reasons," Mrs. Patterson replied diplomatically. "Some couldn't handle the isolation, others couldn't manage a household this size. A few thought they could change him from a businessman into a husband, which was a mistake that got them sent packing quick enough." The warning was clear, and Elizabeth appreciated the older woman's directness. "I'm here to work, Mrs. Patterson, nothing more. Mr. Whitmore has offered my children and me security and opportunity, and I intend to earn both through competent service." Mrs. Patterson studied Elizabeth for a long moment, then nodded with obvious approval. "Good to hear. Now let's get these children fed before they fall over from hunger. Then you and I can discuss how this household operates and what Mr. Whitmore expects from his staff." Over the next several hours, Elizabeth received a comprehensive education in the complex operation of the Circle W Ranch House. The domestic staff included Mrs. Patterson, who handled cooking and supervised the cleaning; Maria, a young Mexican woman who helped with laundry and routine housework; and Tom, an older man who maintained the grounds and handled heavy lifting. During busy periods, additional help was hired from town, but the core staff was expected to manage most situations independently. "Mr. Whitmore entertains frequently," Mrs. Patterson explained, as they toured the formal dining room, which could seat 16 people in elegant comfort. "Business associates, political figures, visitors from back east who are interested in investing in ranch property. These dinners are important for his business relationships, so everything has to be perfect." Elizabeth nodded, understanding that her role would involve much more than simple housekeeping. She would be responsible for creating an environment that reflected Jonathan's status and supported his business objectives, a task that would require all her intelligence and education to accomplish successfully. "What about his personal preferences?" Elizabeth asked. "Favorite foods, daily routines, things I should know to anticipate his needs?" "He's a creature of habit," Mrs. Patterson replied. "Coffee at sunrise, no matter what. Breakfast at 7. Sharp, usually eggs and steak unless he's got stomach trouble. Dinner at 6 when he's home, but his schedule changes based on ranch business. He reads every evening, mostly business journals and newspapers, though I've seen him with books about history and philosophy." The detail about Jonathan's reading habits intrigued Elizabeth, suggesting depths to his character that weren't immediately apparent from his reputation as a hard-driving businessman. A man who read philosophy was someone who thought about larger questions than mere profit and loss, someone who might appreciate intellectual conversation when the opportunity arose. "Mrs. Patterson," Elizabeth said carefully, "may I ask what you think of Mr. Whitmore as an employer? I know he has a reputation for being demanding, but what's he like to work for on a daily basis?" The older woman was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "He's fair," she said finally. "Pays well, treats his people with respect, doesn't ask for anything unreasonable. But he's lonely, though he'd never admit it. Built this big house, made all this money, but doesn't have anyone to share it with. His business is his life, and sometimes I think he wishes it wasn't." The insight into Jonathan's character helped Elizabeth understand the man who had rescued her family from what might have been a desperate fate. Success and wealth, she realized, didn't automatically provide the human connections that made life meaningful, and perhaps Jonathan's offer of employment had been motivated by more than simple business necessity. That evening, after David and Sarah were safely asleep in their new beds, Elizabeth sat in her private sitting room and tried to process the dramatic change in their circumstances. 24 hours earlier, she had been sitting beside a broken wagon with no idea how she would feed her children or find shelter for the night. Now they were safe in comfortable quarters, with steady employment and the promise of a stable future. But she also understood that her success in this position would depend on more than just competent household management. Jonathan Whitmore was clearly a complex man with needs that went beyond efficient domestic service, and Elizabeth suspected that the real challenge of her employment would be learning to navigate the personal dynamics that lay beneath the surface of their business arrangement. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts, and she opened it to find Jonathan standing in the hallway, still dressed in his business suit, but looking somehow less imposing in the warm light of the hallway lamps. "Mrs. Morrison," he said quietly, "I wanted to check on you and the children, make sure you're settling in comfortably." "Very comfortably, thank you," Elizabeth replied. "Mrs. Patterson has been extremely helpful, and the children are already asleep. They haven't slept so soundly in months." Jonathan nodded, his expression showing what might have been satisfaction at having made the right decision. "Good. I'm glad they're safe." He paused, seeming to struggle with something he wanted to say. "Mrs. Morrison, I want you to know that your employment here is based on your qualifications and my needs, nothing more. But I also want you to feel free to speak your mind when you think it's appropriate. I value intelligent conversation, and I suspect you might have insights that could be helpful to me." The invitation to something approaching friendship was unexpected, and Elizabeth felt her heart skip a beat at the possibility of intellectual companionship with a man who was clearly more complex than his reputation suggested. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore," she said carefully. "I appreciate your confidence in my abilities." "Jonathan," he said quietly, "when we're not in front of the staff or visitors, you can call me Jonathan." As he walked away down the long hallway toward his own private quarters, Elizabeth closed her door and leaned against it, her mind racing with the implications of their conversation. She had accepted employment as a housekeeper, but Jonathan's manner suggested that her role might evolve into something more complex and potentially more dangerous to her emotional equilibrium. Subscribe to our channel now to see how Elizabeth's new life unfolds and what happens when duty becomes something deeper. Don't miss the next chapter of this incredible story. 3 months after Elizabeth Morrison's arrival at the Circle W Ranch, the transformation in both the household and its owner was remarkable enough to be noticed by everyone who knew Jonathan Whitmore. The ranch house, which had previously felt like an elegant but cold showplace, now radiated the warmth and comfort that could only come from being a true home rather than merely an impressive structure designed to demonstrate wealth and status. Elizabeth had proven herself to be everything Jonathan had hoped for and more when he made his impulsive offer to help a stranded family. Her management of the household was flawless, with every detail attended to and every social function executed with the kind of sophisticated precision that impressed even Jonathan's most demanding business associates. But more importantly, her presence had brought life to rooms that had previously echoed with loneliness, despite their elegant furnishings. "Mr. Whitmore seems different lately," Mrs. Patterson observed to Maria as they worked together in the kitchen, preparing for another of the elaborate dinner parties that had become more frequent since Elizabeth's arrival. "Happier somehow, smiles more, spends time talking with Mrs. Morrison about books and politics instead of just burying himself in ranch business every evening." Maria nodded knowingly, having observed the subtle changes in the household dynamics with the sharp eyes of someone who understood the complex relationships that develop between employers and employees in isolated ranch settings. "She's good for him," the young woman said simply, "and he's good for her children. Have you seen how Master David follows him around, asking questions about ranch operations? And little Miss Sarah actually laughs now, something I never thought I'd hear when they first arrived." The changes in David and Sarah Morrison were indeed remarkable. The hollow-eyed, frightened children who had arrived at the ranch were now healthy, confident, and clearly thriving in their new environment. David had taken to ranch life with enthusiasm, spending every free moment learning about cattle, horses, and the complex business of running a successful operation. Jonathan, perhaps recognizing something of his younger self in the boy's eagerness, had begun teaching him to ride and involving him in age-appropriate ranch activities. Sarah, meanwhile, had blossomed under the combined attention of her mother, Mrs. Patterson's maternal affection, and Jonathan's surprisingly gentle treatment of children. The little girl who had barely spoken during their first weeks at the ranch now chattered constantly about her lessons, her games, and her growing collection of dolls and books that Jonathan brought back from his business trips to town. But it was the relationship between Elizabeth and Jonathan that provided the most compelling evidence of how dramatically their lives had been changed by that chance encounter on Dusty Creek Road. What had begun as a straightforward business arrangement had evolved into something more complex and emotionally significant, though both parties were careful to maintain the appearance of proper employer-employee relations. Their evening conversations had become a cherished ritual for both of them, discussions that ranged from ranch business to literature, politics, and philosophy. Elizabeth's intelligence and education made her a stimulating conversational partner, while Jonathan's worldly experience and practical wisdom provided insights that challenged her thinking in ways she found intellectually exciting. "I've been thinking about what you said regarding the territorial railroad legislation," Elizabeth said one evening as they sat in Jonathan's study, she with her needlework and he with the latest agricultural journals from back east. "Your argument about the economic benefits is sound, but have you considered the social implications for the smaller communities?" Jonathan looked up from his reading, his attention immediately focused on Elizabeth's question with the kind of intellectual engagement that had become one of the greatest pleasures of his daily routine. What specifically concerns you about the social implications? The railroad will certainly bring economic development, Elizabeth replied thoughtfully, but it will also bring dramatic changes to the character of these frontier communities. Some of those changes might not be entirely positive for the people who have built their lives here. The discussion that followed lasted well into the evening, touching on questions of progress versus tradition, individual opportunity versus community stability, and the role of government in shaping regional development. It was the kind of conversation that Jonathan had never imagined having with anyone in his remote corner of Montana, and certainly not with someone whose presence in his life had begun with an act of simple charity, but as their professional relationship deepened into genuine friendship and intellectual companionship. Both Elizabeth and Jonathan found themselves confronting emotions that complicated their carefully maintained boundaries. Elizabeth, who had sworn never to depend on a man again after losing her husband and their farm, discovered that Jonathan's strength and reliability were awakening feelings she had thought buried forever. Jonathan, who had convinced himself that business success was sufficient for happiness, realized that Elizabeth's presence had revealed depths of loneliness he hadn't even acknowledged. The situation reached a crisis point during a social gathering that brought together the most prominent ranchers and their families from throughout the region. Elizabeth had organized the event with her usual skill, creating an atmosphere of elegant hospitality that showcased Jonathan's position in the territorial social hierarchy. But as the evening progressed, it became clear that several of the visiting ladies had drawn their own conclusions about the beautiful widow who managed Jonathan Whitmore's household with such obvious competence. "Such an interesting arrangement you have here, Jonathan," Mrs. Margaret Crawford, wife of a neighboring rancher, said with the kind of false sweetness that barely concealed malicious intent. "Mrs. Morrison certainly seems to have made herself indispensable to your household management." The comment, delivered within earshot of several other guests, carried implications that made Jonathan's jaw tighten with anger at the insult to Elizabeth's reputation. But before he could respond, Elizabeth herself appeared at his side, with the kind of perfect timing that suggested she had been monitoring the conversation from across the room. "Mrs. Crawford," Elizabeth said with a smile that was both gracious and unmistakably firm, "how kind of you to notice my efforts to maintain Mr. Whitmore's home according to the standards his position requires. I take great pride in my work, just as I'm sure you take pride in your own domestic accomplishments." The response was delivered with such diplomatic skill that Mrs. Crawford found herself unable to escalate the confrontation without appearing vulgar. But the underlying message was clear. Elizabeth Morrison was a professional who would not be intimidated by social pretensions or malicious gossip. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and the household had returned to normal, Jonathan found Elizabeth in the garden behind the house, looking up at the stars with an expression of melancholy that suggested the evening's social tensions had taken their toll on her emotional equilibrium. "I owe you an apology," Jonathan said quietly as he approached her in the moonlit garden. "Mrs. Crawford's comments were inappropriate, and I should have addressed them more directly." "You don't owe me any apology," Elizabeth replied softly. "I understood the risks of this position when I accepted it. A woman in my circumstances will always face speculation and judgment, regardless of how carefully she conducts herself." "But you shouldn't have to face it alone," Jonathan said, his voice carrying an intensity that suggested he was speaking from deeper emotions than simple employer concern. "Elizabeth, these past 3 months have been the happiest of my life, and not because my household runs more efficiently." The admission hung in the evening air between them, carrying implications that both had been feeling, but neither had dared to voice. Elizabeth felt her heart racing as she realized that Jonathan was approaching the boundary they had both carefully maintained since her arrival at the ranch. "Jonathan," she said carefully, "I need you to understand that my gratitude for what you've done for my children and me doesn't obligate me to anything beyond the professional relationship we agreed upon." "I know that," Jonathan replied quickly, "and I'm not asking you to feel obligated to anything. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that what's developed between us might be worth exploring, despite the complications." Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, weighing her feelings against the practical realities of their situation. She cared for Jonathan more than she had thought possible when she accepted his offer of employment, but she also understood that romantic involvement with her employer could jeopardize the security she had worked so hard to build for her children. "What are you asking me exactly?" she said finally. "I'm asking you to marry me," Jonathan said simply. "Not because I feel sorry for you, not because it would be convenient, but because I love you and I believe you might love me too." The proposal was delivered with the same directness that characterized all of Jonathan's business dealings, but Elizabeth could hear the vulnerability beneath his confident tone. This was a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted through wealth and determination, but who understood that love couldn't be purchased or negotiated. "I do love you," Elizabeth said quietly, the admission surprising her with its clarity and certainty. "But love alone doesn't solve the practical problems we would face. Marriage between us would create complications for your business relationships, challenges for my children's social acceptance, questions about my motives that could damage your reputation." "Let me worry about my reputation," Jonathan said firmly. "And as for your children, they already think of this place as home and me as, well, as family. David asks me questions about everything from cattle breeding to territorial politics, and Sarah shows me her drawings every evening after dinner. We're already a family in everything but name." The truth of his observation made Elizabeth's resistance begin to crumble. David and Sarah had indeed flourished under Jonathan's influence, finding in him the father figure they had lost when their biological father died. And she had to admit that her own happiness during the past 3 months had been more complete than anything she had experienced since her husband's death. "If I marry you," Elizabeth said slowly, "it has to be as an equal partner, not as a grateful employee who's been elevated above her station. I won't be any man's charity case, even yours." Jonathan's smile was the first genuinely relaxed expression Elizabeth had seen on his face since the evening's social tensions began. "Mrs. Morrison," he said formally, "you stopped being a charity case the moment you proved you could manage my household better than anyone I've ever hired. You've been my equal partner in everything but title since the day you arrived." As they stood together in the moonlit garden, surrounded by the vast Montana landscape that had brought them together, Elizabeth realized that the broken wagon on Dusty Creek Road had led her not just to employment and security, but to the kind of love and partnership she had never dared to hope for again. 6 months later, the society pages of territorial newspapers carried news of the marriage between prominent rancher Jonathan Whitmore and Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison, described as a union that brought together 2 of the most respected individuals in Montana Territory. But for Elizabeth, David, and Sarah, the real story was simpler and more profound. They had found their way home, and Jonathan had discovered that the greatest wealth wasn't measured in acres or cattle, but in the love of a family that had chosen to build their future together. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to follow more incredible stories of love, redemption, and second chances from the Old West. Hit that subscribe button now and join our community of dreamers and believers.